Great, excellent. Welcome everybody to the community climate conversation around fostering community resilience, capturing carbon in trees and ecosystems. This is the fourth community climate conversation that we've had as part of a series, and we'll be meeting tonight from 6 to 8 p.m. We'll be diving into ecosystems and sequestration, as well as community resilience and preparedness during the call today. And we are recording this presentation, and we're recording the presentation portion of tonight's meeting, not the breakout rooms. And the purpose of that is to ensure that those that weren't able to join tonight have access to the information as well. And so that'll be going up on the project website a few days after the presentation. So I just really want to welcome everybody. My name is Gretchen Muller, and I will be one of several facilitators that will be facilitating tonight, and really excited that you all are here and excited to dive in with you all tonight. So thank you all so much for being here. We can go ahead to the next slide, please. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to Haley, who is going to walk through an option that you all have via the Zoom call tonight related to closed captioning. So Haley, want to walk us through how to get that on the screen, if that would be helpful to folks?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. So at the bottom bar on your Zoom, you should be able to see some of the settings that you usually have, like participants and chat and share screen. One of those should say live transcript, which is, you can see it on the slide at the top. And then if you click the little caret right next to it, you should be able to choose show subtitles. And then additionally, if you want to change what they look like, you should be able to click the caret again, choose subtitle settings, and then change what they look like. Hopefully that works out okay for everybody.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, and so closed captioning option for you all, and an opportunity to make tonight's workshop more accessible. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. So if you will take a moment, and we do have people that are continuing to enter the call, so welcome to everybody that's here tonight. So if you can take a moment, and in both renaming yourself, so hover over, and you've got some directions here, click on the participants bar, so you see the participants bar on your screen, hover over your name and click more, then rename yourself, and inviting everybody to share your first name and your neighborhood, the neighborhood that you are calling in from tonight. And then once you do that, if you'd like to do that, to answer in the chat, what does a resilient community look like to you? So what does a resilient community look like to you? And putting your response in the chat. What does a resilient community look like to you? Susan from Echo Lake, diverse and meeting the needs of the community. From Maggie from Highland Terrace, an educated community. From Diane and Sid from Echo Lake, lots of connections to neighbors, folks in the city. From Key, and please let me know if I pronounce that correctly, from Richmond Highlands, same as the two above for me. From David and Ben, it goes through the toughest time singing We Shall Overcome. Any others I would like to share via the chat? What does a resilient community look like to you? From Mary, rights of nature are respected. From Janice and climate change parlance, a community that has infrastructure and services in place to adapt to climate change. Bonnie from Hillwood, a diverse community of people and healthy habitat for all that can thrive, survive as life goes on. From Cami from Highland Terrace, making it through large storms without irreparable damage. from Nancy from Richmond Beach, people aware of the interconnectedness of all life and how our actions affect the biosphere. As additional ideas come to you in terms of what a resilient community looks like to you, feel free to keep adding them into the chat. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Thank you all so much to those that shared. We've got from Ginger, final thought, neighbors knowing neighbors. Yeah, so keep them coming. It's really nice to see how you all are defining what a resilient community looks like to you. Go to the next slide. So what does our evening look like tonight? So in terms of workshop purpose, we've got several workshop purposes to review the climate action planning process. So what does the whole process look like and where are we at right now with this community conversation number 4? We'll do a recap of feedback from what we heard from the community in community climate conversation number 3. This was just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm recognizing some names here. So a few of you were at that meeting as well. Share the goal and kind of collective goal around this conversation tonight. Introducing proposed sequestration and resiliency strategies and actions, and then doing a deeper dive into reviewing those particular associated actions to get community feedback on those from you all in terms of anything you want to change, any gaps that you're seeing. And so how are we going to get there? So we are, as I mentioned, going to do a quick recap of what we heard from the last community conversation 3. Hearing from Cameron on an overview of the climate action planning goals, as well as our goals for tonight. And then we'll be hearing 2 presentations. We'll have a short Q&A between each of those 2 presentations, one on sequestration and one on resilience, an overview of the strategies associated with them, the goals and targets, as well as the action lists. And those strategies and actions are what we'll be diving into during the breakout sessions. Then we'll come back together, we'll do a report out across all the breakout rooms, and then we'll wrap up with next steps. And so keeping the workshop purpose and the workshop agenda in mind, and when you think about sequestration, keeping in mind trees and ecosystems, when you think about resilience, keeping in mind community preparedness, we are going to, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please, here, Haley. In just a moment, we'll be asking you all to fill out a Zoom poll. So it's going to pop up on your screen. And the reason to ask you this is we have several strategies and actions that span both the trees and ecosystems or sequestration, as well as the resilience and community preparedness strategies and actions. And so we are asking you to pick, because we can't go through, there's so many strategies and actions, all of us can't go through all the strategies and actions. So if you can pick, you may not have a preference in terms of which breakout room you want to go to. But if you do, we want to make sure to get you in that breakout room, whether it's communities and ecosystems or it's community resilience and preparedness. If you pick either is fine with you, then we'll pre-assign you to one of those 2 breakouts. We'll give you all a minute to take this. And let me know, Haley. Oh, I see it on my screen too when we've got full participation. If you don't take the Zoom poll, we'll give you all another 30 seconds or so. If you don't take it, it's fine as well. And we'll just assign you. And then if you do have a preference, but you made it into the room that you were hoping not to get into, then we can easily send you back over to another room as well. Okay, so thank you so much for that input. And with that, we will go ahead to the next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Cameron for an overview of the planning process related to the climate action plan, where we've been and where we're headed.
Thanks, Gretchen. And hey, everybody, it's good to see a lot of familiar faces and names. I'm Cameron Reed. I'm the Environmental Services Program Manager here for the City of Shoreline, working on our climate action plan update, which I know a lot of you have been involved in, have been attending our community climate conversations thus far, but did want to just do a quick overview of where we're at in the process for those who are maybe joining us for the first time. So you can go to the next slide, please. And yeah, so we are updating our climate action plan to identify key actions the city can take to address the climate crisis. We completed, as a city, our first climate action plan back in 2013, and have been measuring our community-wide emissions since 2009. And since that time, we've taken many bold actions to address climate change and have seen some progress in reducing our shoreline's community-wide emissions approximately 5% despite a growing population. So some progress. However, as you can see on this graph, this trend is not on track to prevent the worst consequences of a climate breakdown. And in the fall, City Council committed to updated emissions reduction targets to really reflect the best current science on how much we would need to reduce emissions in shoreline to really limit global warming to that 1.5 degree threshold. So if you click one more time, yeah, there we go. So there were our previous targets and then our new targets in the orange dots and orange lines, calling for a 60% emissions reduction community-wide by 2030 and net zero no later than 2050. Next slide, please. And so the climate action plan will identify key transformative actions that the city can take to drastically reduce our community-wide emissions to hit these targets. It'll have 5 focus areas, and the emissions reduction will largely occur in 3 of those, which are transportation, buildings, and energy, and waste and consumption. Excuse me. And the recent science is very clear that we have a narrow window of opportunity, really the next decade to reduce emissions if we're to prevent runaway climate change. And so, yeah, we need to continue working to reduce emissions. But we know that we can no longer afford to just reduce emissions. We have to prepare and ensure our community is protected from the impacts that are already here, that we're already seeing, and that are significantly impacting communities around the world. And so we'll have the preparedness and resilience focus area, which we'll dive into here shortly. And then lastly, there's a growing body of science acknowledging the role that natural systems play in both mitigating local impacts of climate change, but also reversing climate change by drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it in plants, soils, and ecosystems. So some people refer it as a natural climate solutions. We're calling it our ecosystems and sequestration focus area. And we'll also be discussing that focus area tonight. We also will want to address equity in how we are in our climate action planning process and in the strategies and actions we're proposing. And I'll say a little bit more about that here in a minute too. Next slide, please. And so this is just an overview of where we're at. So we've been working at this really since the beginning of last year. We did a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We started working with a group of community climate advisors last summer to really help frame the climate action plan. We had a kickoff event back in the fall around those updated targets to frame our vision for the climate action plan. And now we're here in what we're calling phase 2, where we've been honing the actual strategies in each focus area with staff and now getting community feedback, which we will then take in the coming months to prioritize these actions and really develop a short list of the most effective actions with the most community support that we can take here as the city. And then moving forward, we'll write that up into the plan and present that to council later this summer and fall. And I think I'll turn it back over to you, Gretchen, for the next slide.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Cameron. So we wanted to share with you all, even if you were at workshop 3 or community climate conversation 3, just a recap of some of the feedback that we heard from that most recent conversation just a couple of weeks ago. So it included hearing concerns about some of the draft actions, which largely included equity considerations about the costs of homeowners to electrify, paired with a general lack of awareness surrounded by electrification, which should include but not be limited to the benefits of electrifying, as well as emissions reduction potential, resources and best practices. So it was also many folks kind of brought to the conversation, this kind of lack of awareness was also a concern on the consumption and waste actions, where perceived lack of knowledge is a major barrier for shoreline residents in properly disposing of waste. So that came up across breakout rooms in the conversations that we had a couple weeks ago. Participants also discussed concerns relating to the accessibility of waste disposal services, especially in different residential situations. So certain residential situations, it was harder than others in terms of those waste disposal services and access to them. Gaps in the draft action list were identified, including a need for actions related to weatherization and building insulation actions, as well as actions implementing waste campaigns and programs, such as potential partnerships with entities like Gridwell or promoting the food waste reduction app called Too Good to Go. We also heard that the actions that promoted a switch to renewable energy, especially solar installation, and all the actions that promoted waste reduction or recovery, making sure that they were equitable and accessible across those actions. So as Cameron mentioned, that focus on equity and having that equity lens across the various actions. And if you're interested, but weren't able to attend, or maybe you did attend and a lot of life has happened in those last couple of weeks and want a refresh of what was talked about, the recording will be available online at the City of Shoreline's project website, as well as a meeting summary. And actually the recording is already up there, but the meeting summary will be available very soon related to that. So some of the key highlights from the conversation from our community climate conversation number 3, and we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Great. So you'll see here our roadmap that Cameron walked through. And so we're currently in phase 2. So where we've been collaborating with you all, as well as key individuals within the City of Shoreline, on refining the strategies and actions, and then hosting this set of these 3 community conversations to do a deeper dive into the strategies and actions as they relate to the various focus areas that are covered in the Climate Action Plan. From there, we'll be moving into, and you see that we are here, phase 2. From there, we'll be moving into phase 3, where we're taking everything that we're hearing tonight, everything that we've heard in the previous 2 other climate conversations, and doing those further refinements on the strategies and actions. Those all get packaged up into a final draft, a climate action plan that will then be circulated and posted online for further comment, further public comment, and we'll be having our final community conversation at that time to receive any final gaps, any other considerations that you really want to make sure are noted in the CAP. And then we'll move into the monitoring phase. So implementing the actions and annual monitoring and reporting. Any questions on the climate action process? And please put any questions that you may have, points of clarification on the process, where we've been, where we're headed, in the chat. And we'll do a quick pause here for clarifying questions on the climate action process in the chat. Give everybody a moment to type something into the chat before we move into ecosystems and sequestration. All right, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Cameron, to provide an overview, goals and targets, and action list on the ecosystems and sequestration and shoreline focus area.
Awesome. Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, so let's jump in and yeah, next slide, please. So just real quick, stepping slightly back again, looking at the 3 types of actions we're including in the CAP. So the first is mitigation, so emissions reduction, and this is probably what you're used to hearing about in conversations about climate change, and it continues to be very, very important if we want to turn climate around. So that is, turning off the tap of the bathtub is a good metaphor, and we're not going to make progress if we don't turn that tap off or slow it down. And then sequestration on the right, so that's the section we're jumping into here. Think of that as, pulling the plug and draining the bathtub, so taking some of the water out of the tub. And then adaptation and resilience, which we'll come to shortly, is learning how to swim with the water that's in there. Next slide, please. And so real quick, for those of you, I'm sure many are familiar, but what is sequestration? What are we talking about? Not going deep into the science, but broadly speaking, this is any process that actually can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So there's geological processes. There's also technological methods, machines that literally can capture carbon, but there's also biological sequestration. And so that's primarily what we're going to be talking about in this section. And it's largely a plant-driven process through photosynthesis, storing in plant tissues, which decay and can become incorporated into the soil. And it's important to note, so on this graph, which I believe is for forests across the US, they're showing the percent in the carbon cycle of where that's stored in the ecosystem. And so you can see 26% is stored in the above ground, leaves and branches of, say, a tree. But there's up to 54% that gets incorporated and stored in the soil. So that's another key strategy to consider. We're not just talking about trees. We're talking about all of this whole ecosystem. With soils in particular, it's potentially a big carbon reservoir and comes with lots of other benefits. Think about improved plant health, for agriculture or landscapes, and stormwater filtration, et cetera. So click one more time. And so this is a diagram showing the relative amounts of carbon storage between plants and soils in different ecosystems around the world. So we would be in that temperate forest bubble, roughly, and you can see there's about 57 in the actual plant tissues and 96 in the soil. I also want to just point out the wetlands there and just the massive amount in the wetland soil. So there's sort of growing awareness of the role of and potentialities around wetlands for carbon storage there. And we will largely be talking about trees and soils here. And next slide. So looking at trees, looking at shorelines, urban forest, which is really just this incredible system and asset that we have here as a community in shoreline. This is data from our 2018 urban tree canopy assessment. And you can see, so at that time, we have a 37% tree canopy cover, and 14% of the surface area of the city was identified as possible planting area. So area that had space and use that could support additional trees. And the rest being either hardscape or road or another use, say a ball field or something that wasn't we didn't consider as possible planting area, and then some breakdowns under that. So a lot of the current tree canopy, 66%, is in residential areas, as well as a lot of the possible planting area, up to almost 70%. But our parks and public open spaces and private open spaces are still a really, really important thing we need to consider here. And then just to note that we've had seen our urban forest canopy grow by 21% since 2009. Next slide, please. And so in terms of emissions, how much is our urban forest doing? How much can it capture for us? And so as part of this CAP process, we ran an assessment based on current land cover using the US Forest Service's iTree Canopy tool. So again, this is a high-level estimate of the potential greenhouse gas emissions reduction benefits from shoreline urban forests. And based on this analysis, you can click ahead once. A lot of carbon is currently stored in trees. So over 400,000 metric tons of carbon equivalent, which is a lot. And then, but if we look at how much is captured in over the course of any given year, as those trees photosynthesize and add mass, then we can see, it's less. It's about 14,000 metric tons is estimated captured in the course of a year by our entire urban forest across the city. And so how does this stack up to the emissions we produce each year in shoreline through our activities, through our living here in the city? Next slide. So in 2019, which is when the data we used to complete our emissions inventory, our most recent emissions inventory. So our direct emissions from activities in shoreline, largely cars that we drive, the energy we use to heat our homes and buildings, and the waste we produce and dispose of, created just under 250,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions. And again, you can see the colors there. These largely come from transportation, so 56% of those emissions. That's kind of that olivey green color. And then the second biggest category is lumping a couple of these bands, and that's natural gas use in buildings. So that's over 30% of shoreline's emissions. And then you can see in the top graph, our urban forest is capturing, about 6% of that impact. So we definitely, if we want to address climate change, we need to significantly reduce emissions from cars and buildings. As these sources of climate pollution really exceed and outstrip what our urban forests can absorb. However, we also need to continue to support our urban forests and other ecosystems, both for their sequestration ability and for the host of other benefits that they provide. And we'll really talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. And so just, noting kind of where we're at, what are we already doing in this space? What have we been supporting here? So the shoreline community has been very strongly supportive of our urban forest for many, many years. It's led us to earn Tree City designation back in 2012 and formed the Tree Board shortly thereafter. We created our urban forest strategic plan back in 2014 to really provide resources and a structure to support our urban forest. We contributed to the county's first the 1 million trees initiative and now the 3 million trees initiative to plant, protect, and restore 3 million trees countywide by 2025. We've also increased our street tree planting efforts and our overall urban forestry management over the past decade. And this is largely our Parks Urban Forestry team, and we have Joseph Callahan, our senior parks maintenance worker in charge of urban forestry, on the call. So due to their great work over there. And then we also have, our tree regulations for private property. So that would be regulating what trees can be removed and how they have to be replaced during development. And just this week and last week, changes to these requirements were passed by council. And these were largely code amendments proposed by the community to increase protection of existing mature trees on private property. Next slide, please. And one of the other projects over the past couple of years, since 2019, we've been partnering with a growing network of community volunteers, businesses, and nonprofits called the Green Shoreline Partnership. So they are working currently in 7 different parks around the city. It's community-driven projects to restore different areas of our urban forest in our parks and open spaces. And they really do include a significant amount of tree planting in addition to invasive species removal and the whole restoration effort. Think of areas where it's potentially just a sea of blackberry or something, and new plants, new trees can't get established. So removing that, installing natives. And so last year in 2021, there were 700 volunteers involved, and we planted over 3,000 trees in 2021 through this program. And this supports both the health of our current forest and increases the canopy. Next slide, please. I also wanted to call out that we've been piloting the use of some carbon credit programs to support additional tree planting and restoration in our parks and open spaces. So on the right was a project started in Ballinger Open Space a few years ago, was our first one. And so we received funding and through Mountains to Sound Greenway helped do the project. So you can see them storing, plants and trees in a degraded area there. And then on the left is some work that Joseph, our urban forester, led to connect through the Evergreen Carbon Capture Program, which connects businesses with tree planting opportunities here locally. So I think these were from Nordstrom, and this is at Shoreview Park, so it was a hillside area. So turning an area that was turf into a more urban forest canopy with native evergreen tree species. Next slide, please. And I also just wanted to highlight some of the work we're doing to increase compost usage. So again, this is key to putting carbon back into the soil, and it has many co-benefits beyond carbon storage, really boosting the ecosystem health, microbial life in the soil. It helps with stormwater absorption in the wet season, and it helps also hold water better in the dry season, reduces the need for any pesticides or herbicides, and it's also supports a closed loop where we would buy back finished compost made locally from our food scraps and yard debris that we put in our green bins around Shoreline. And so here's a photo of our grounds maintenance division, which has started using a lot more compost and wood chips, and you can see the burlap, the sheet mulching method there for a natural weed barrier. We also have the Soak It Up rebate program that provides money for private property owners to install native vegetation landscaping on their properties. That could include native trees and includes amending the soil with compost. And then we have requirements both from the state to the city to use compost where we can in city projects. And we require for private developers to amend soil with compost when putting in landscapes and amenity zones. Next slide. And so here is just a high level overview of the primary strategies for this section of the CAP. Again, you'll be getting the full text and really diving into discussing the nitty gritty on them in the breakout rooms, but I just wanted to highlight it. So, the number one, it's pretty straightforward, but increasing tree canopy and urban forest health is the goal there. And then a couple opportunities to do that in our parks and open spaces, also looking at street trees and getting really focused about that. Also looking at how we can support more trees on private property. And then also looking at, we have a goal of achieving carbon neutral city operations by 2030. So at that point, we will need to begin offsetting our emissions. And so we would like to do that where possible in local ecosystem-based projects. And then the second strategy is really where we can support increased soil sequestration, really through compost usage primarily. And with that, I'm seeing a lot of activity in the chat. So I think I will open it up for questions.
Great. And we had, if you scroll all the way to the kind of the top of the line here from Marion, a question about, other than feedback, how can an individual get involved on this CAP process?
Yeah, with that's a great question. So yeah, we're currently, primarily looking for community feedback. We don't have like in terms of like helping promote it out in the community. That's something we'll be looking at when we go and start talking about implementation, but we don't currently have any opportunities set up.
Yeah, so coming to these is a really great way to have your voice heard and captured in the CAP process and at these community conversations. Great. Then we have a question in here from Bonnie from Hillwood about carbon being sequestered under buildings.
That's a great question. I don't have good information on that. I mean, I would assume it's just wet in the soil, but yeah, I can't really speak to that.
Great. And then a question about the tree planting program. And do you happen to know, Cameron, or the person from the city of Shoreline representing the tree program, if any of the replacement trees are being replaced with evergreens versus deciduous?
I just clarifying, I'm assuming you're talking about like development, trees lost during development and the required replantings?
With all the buildings going up, yeah. So is there a requirement to replace with evergreens? Yeah,
maybe we have one of our associate planners, Alicia Hallberg, on the call. And maybe Alicia, are you able to speak to the specific replanting requirements at all in terms of species?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm not aware of requirements for specific species when we're looking at the city's critical areas, so environmentally critical areas such as steep slopes, areas near streams, wetlands, and their associated buffers, just to name a few. We do require native species, but I think that's really good feedback to include in our small group chats.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Then a couple of questions here, Cameron and Alicia, maybe if you can stay spotlighted there about the data. So where is the 30, there was a slide that referenced 37%. And so maybe if we can quickly hop back to that slide, wanting to know, where that 37% came from, and assuming part of the question is around kind of the year of data that you used.
Yeah, and maybe Joe can jump in too if I'm wrong here, but this was a study, which I think is our most recent one, from 2018, but the data was from 2017.
Okay. Great.
So it's a point in time stat there.
Thank you. And that also is Bonnie's question too, date of the canopy sited.
And maybe, Joe, do you know, are we in the process or have plans to do another canopy assessment anytime soon?
That's due to be completed at the same time as the urban forestry strategic plan is being updated, which should be towards the end of this year.
Great, thanks, Joe. So yeah, that's the most recent data we have available.
Great. And then another question. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I had one question about the urban tree canopy definition. Are you just saying, is your definition just a tree, or is it like divided between older trees that are obviously more beneficial versus a tree that's 5 foot?
Yeah, good question, Will. And I'll let Joe jump in here in a second, but I believe like literally we're looking at satellite imagery to look at the physical extent of the tree canopy during the growing season. Joe, yeah, is that accurate?
It's a bit of both between using satellite imagery, just raw images, but then also using LiDAR technology, basically a sonar that creates a 3D map. And yes, it is an estimate, but it's industry standard for doing mass urban canopy assessments, as opposed to a tree inventory, which is actually going up to each individual tree and getting the species of it, measuring the diameter of it, putting it in an inventory. This is a mass general estimation of canopy.
Okay, so if you're using kind of a sonar technology as part of the gauge, could you put together kind of a heat map where there's like a high density of large amounts of trees versus a 6 foot, or just shorter trees?
That's all done by the consultant remotely. They have their own metrics to decide on these things. We don't decide on that comes through the consultant.
Sure, but is that type of map available?
Is the raw images of LiDAR available?
Yeah.
I'll jump in here. Yeah, I think that canopy assessment report, there's a whole report. There's a ton of maps that are available, and I can, if I have a minute, I'll try to send that in the chat here for you, or I can send it in our follow-up email. But yeah, there's a lot of that data has been published, and you can see, yeah, we can see using that where we have canopy and where there are gaps.
Okay. So
I think to answer the point of your question, that would show up, right? If a tree is really young, it's gonna show up in the image as being having a very narrow canopy, as opposed to one single Doug fir or something that's going to have a bigger canopy. That's going to show up.
And we've got time for one more question before we move into the climate resilience presentation, followed by Q&A. And we do have a couple questions in here, and then lots of comments related to to developers and the impact that developers are having on existing trees. And so we can cover some of that in the breakout rooms and as we look at the strategies and actions related to trees there. So be sure to bring up your points in the breakout rooms. And then a kind of final question here is for Melody around, is the canopy done via drone, or how do you get that data, Joe?
That's a good question. Yeah, Joe, jump in. I think it's satellite, right?
No, LiDAR is with a plane, with a low altitude plane that basically a sonar attached to the bottom that is scanning and sending out sonar waves or some sort of electromagnetic wave. And yeah, it can be pretty accurate.
Excellent, thank you. So with that, we are going to go ahead and move into the next presentation portion, where we'll be hearing again from Cameron, this time on the focus area, climate resiliency and preparedness. He'll be sharing both an overview, goals and targets, as well as the action list. And then we'll be diving into the discussion, the community conversation portion in breakout rooms. Turning it back over to you, Cameron.
Awesome. Thanks, Gretchen. And I do just want to acknowledge there's a ton of great questions here in the chat. So I'm going to do my best in our follow-up from this event we'll compile some answers to these and send them out with our when we do that workshop summary. So, if you have continued questions on this, please keep putting them in the chat. But yeah, let's move on. So this next subject, shifting gears a bit to talk about climate resiliency and preparedness, and recognizing that, we've broken these things out into focus areas, but obviously there's a lot of overlap. These are all very interconnected, when we're talking about buildings, when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about trees, talking about resilience. So, we've sort of broken this out as a matter of convenience, but we do recognize these are all very interconnected. Next slide, please. So how is climate change impacting us and in our region? As you're aware, yeah, it's already impacting us here in Shoreline, primarily sort of a big three impacts that we're feeling locally. So that would be one, through the increased heat, sort of seeing more and more likely extreme heat events, such as we saw last summer. Also with the changing precipitation patterns, largely in the winter, that are leading to both more flood risk in the winter with those short duration, high intensity storms, but also less precipitation falling as snow, which leads to more drought risk in the summer. And then last but not least, the reduced air quality from wildfire smoke and sort of that increased risk really around the Western United States. And it's important to remember, though, that these are really just local impacts, and by no means are these the only impacts that we will be experiencing. And communities around the world are experiencing things that are even more extreme. And then just real quick, when we think about resilience, this is an increasingly common sort of buzzword when we're talking about climate change. But basically, we're really talking about, the ability to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to these type of impacts. So that's what we're talking about when we say climate resilience. Next slide. So in 2020, we completed a climate impacts and vulnerability study to look at our public infrastructure, our systems, operations, and our community in light of the data for these projected impacts to the community. And the goal was to identify, where we had exposure, where our infrastructure was most vulnerable, where we had the least adaptive capacity, and where we need to start changing our thinking about what we're building, how we're building it, and the systems we have in place. So here's a few of the elements that were considered and how they were ranked in terms of risk and exposure. So you can see, air quality, hyperlocal flooding impacts, ecosystems, buildings, and heat events really rising to the top, with some stormwater system impacts like our storm drain sizing, our pipes and culverts, and our trees and open spaces kind of in this moderate vulnerability range. Next slide, please. And one of the outcomes of this study was the creation of a climate impacts tool. And primarily we're using this right now for our city capital project planning to start thinking about, really to start thinking about climate resilience at the start of a project. So, this is a snapshot of the tool. You would map your project and then navigate through these different tabs with different information overlaid to see where do we have opportunities to really build resiliency and address some of these issues that we know are going to be problems moving forward when we're going in to make a capital improvement. So this first tab here is surface water vulnerabilities, looking for ways to enhance stormwater management, really. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oops, sorry. Can we go back one? Yeah, perfect. So the second is a map of urban heat islands and shoreline. So the urban heat island effect is, when paved, impervious surfaces really hold and trap heat, end up significantly warmer than areas that are shaded or have substantial vegetative cover, or are surfaces designed to reflect heat. So in an event like the extreme heat we had last June, those areas here in red or orange might be several degrees, often up to 7 or 10 degrees hotter than unshaded areas. And again, so we're seeing red concentrated really in the commercial corridors, but also where we have, just large buildings with large parking lots. So this could be schools or churches or, other facilities like that. Next slide, please. And the last layer in the tool is around equity. And this is, it's just important to remember that not everyone is impacted the same by these things. So for example, if you have an underlying health condition, asthma or something, or you live or work outside, you're going to be more impacted by wildfire smoke. And this is really where we start to see the interconnection of things and really intersects with a lot of systemic issues. So if somebody is also experiencing lower income or systemic racism, they might even have less ability to adapt. And this is where climate change really acts as a threat multiplier. And these people or communities are often referred to as frontline communities. So those that are disproportionately impacted by climate change due to existing and historic racial, social, environmental, and economic inequalities or inequities, and who may have limited resources or capacity to adapt. So in shoreline, this could include, people of color or indigenous or immigrants and refugees, people living with low incomes, communities experiencing, disproportionate pollution exposure, people who live or work outside, those with underlying health issues, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of different factors. So we really need to center equity in this process and in the actions we take to build resilience and to mitigate climate change. Next slide, please. And so, let's turn to think about some ways, some strategies, some key strategies to build resilience. So, we've already talked a good deal about trees, and I'm sure you're aware of that really trees provide a host of benefits, way beyond just sequestration, and beyond the obvious benefit of shade, but also, improving air quality, reducing stormwater runoff, buffering noise, and creating a more enjoyable, enjoyable urban environment. There's also a ton of research on, significant documented mental health and psychological benefits from having nature around, from spending time in nature, and from incorporating nature into cities. And then there's a whole host of other ecosystem services, right? So habitat and food for wildlife, and really the fact that this is an interconnected system and ecosystem. And so for all of those reasons, trees really can be a key resilience strategy. Next slide, please. And so there's also really a growing movement around the world to switch from traditional stormwater infrastructure, so things like pipes and ditches and catch basins and big concrete, paved creeks and such, to engineered systems that are designed to mimic nature, to get water runoff to slow down and to soak into the soil where it's filtered, while at the same time, including more habitat, including plants and trees. And so there's a ton of overlapping benefits for these type of systems too. And this is something we, in the industry speak, we would call green stormwater infrastructure, but it's things like rain gardens, it's things like permeable pavement or a green roof. And here's just a couple examples from around shoreline. So the bottom right are the bioretention cells, so essentially a engineered rain garden along Ashworth. The top right is the Cromwell Park stormwater pond, which is really an engineered wetland, that we put into the park. And this was a photo taken when it was first installed, but if you go there now, it's just thick, lush, a ton of vegetation, a ton of trees. And then the bottom left is a rain garden installed at a home in Shoreline through the Soak It Up rebate program. So again, really lush thing that is also a functioning piece of stormwater infrastructure. So this is another key strategy when we think about those overlapping impacts and ways that we can try to get more vegetation, more trees in urban spaces, and also protect from the stormwater impacts we're seeing. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, really looking at our emergency preparedness systems and resources to make sure that we're planning for and have resources for events like flooding, extreme heat, and wildfire smoke, and ensuring that the people who most need those resources have access to them. So making sure we have things in language, looking at things like filter fan kits, to help people without air conditioning get through some of the smoke events. Or last summer, we had to open a cooling center for the first time. So starting to plan for that and really look at where are the gaps in our operations, where are opportunities to kind of support community preparedness around these types of events. And with that, I think we'll go to the last slide here, which is just, overviewing those three main goals for this section, recognizing that, it's a pretty big and interconnected topic. And so there, some of these, especially the last one, is a little bit of a catch-all currently. But we have, the first one being to really, when we're thinking about our buildings, our infrastructure, and our land use, really making sure we're incorporating climate resiliency into those decisions. And so you'll see actions in the breakout around that. And then number two is really around that community preparedness. So strengthening our preparedness resources and efforts in the community around specific to extreme heat, flooding, and wildfire smoke. And then lastly, looking for opportunities to increase community awareness of these impacts and partnering with the community to support and build a really resilient community. So it's really great to see all of your answers to that icebreaker question earlier, and I look forward to reading through that. But with that, I think we'll take some questions on this section.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Cameron. So keep the questions coming in the chat. That's where we're looking for questions during this Q&A portion. We did have a comment about schools, a couple of comments in here about schools. One comment from Janet from Ridgecrest about the hottest areas and the heat island effect graphic where schools have crumb rubber athletic fields. And then a comment from Cami about the paved surfaces and large buildings associated with schools. And then we've got a question here from Melody about stormwater management directly affecting sidewalk design, resulting loss in right-of-way trees. If this is a known way to construct, why aren't we using this now with the current sidewalk designs? So any comments from the planning side of things related to sidewalk design and requirements around that?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. So we definitely have been using green stormwater infrastructure for a while. We've piloted a bunch of different stuff in the right of way. We do have sections of permeable sidewalk. So yeah, we're definitely using it. And it's just an issue of, it's where can we continue? Where can we deploy this in an even greater capacity? And where are the biggest needs? And yeah, I mean, the right of way issue and the sidewalk issue is it's really true because there's a lot of trade-offs there, right? Because especially as we think about supporting alternative transportation, which is a key emissions reduction, we also want to be thinking about, we don't want to be creating more urban heat islands. So we need to incorporate, the trees and the green stormwater. So there's definitely a lot to think about. And that was the whole purpose of this, building out this tool. And so you'll see some actions around, continuing to refine that tool and use it. So we're currently using it as we plan capital projects. but it's going to be something we want to continue to lean into.
Thanks, Cameron. And then another question here from Bonnie from Hillwood. Will the city be doing anything to get the school district to convert more lawns to mulch?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see some actions in here about that. So welcome additional ideas. They're definitely a huge property owner in the city and have a lot of large parking lots, a lot of lawn space. So that's totally something we want to be looking at in this climate action plan. Great point.
Excellent. And then a couple of comments in here about saving trees when designing new sidewalks. And those are types of things also, to Cameron's point too, when we get into the breakout rooms and take a look at the strategies and associated actions, seeing if there's more you want to add there related to that. And same with the comment from Nancy about crumb rubber. Let's see. We've got time for one more question here before we move. We're going to go ahead and get set up here for the breakout rooms. A question about rain garden in the middle of a historic street and kind of replacement of installing hardscape drainage. Not sure if that's a question or kind of a statement there, but anything that you know about that particular site, Cameron? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, maybe Bonnie, if you can put the location in the chat, I might have more context. But I do know, so a lot of, like when we first started this, maybe 8-10 years ago, using some of this infrastructure, it was very new in the Pacific Northwest. The Seattle area has been kind of on the cutting edge of it. So we put a lot of stuff in and then learned like, oh, certain kinds of things have different maintenance issues, or maybe they're not as good in certain locations. And so I know there's been sort of an iterative process of figuring out where these things work the best. But yeah, I don't know, without knowing the location, I don't know the story on that specific rain garden.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. So we are going to go ahead and move into the getting everybody set up here for the breakout rooms and what those are going to look like. And if any additional questions come up that you didn't get a chance to put in the chat here, then please bring them up in the breakout rooms as well. And we'll be sure to capture those on the mural boards, which is going to be the platform that each of the facilitators are using to capture the conversations that we all have there. And so with that, we can go ahead, to the next slide, please. Great. So this is a slide, again, for those folks that weren't here the last couple of times, and just as a refresher for those that were. So this is how we're going to be setting up we're in just a couple minutes here, going to be heading into the breakout rooms. And then we will, while you're in the breakout room, the facilitator will take just a moment to kind of recalibrate, get the mural board shared. As I mentioned, that's going to be where we are capturing all of the conversations that are happening across each of the breakout rooms. And then we'll be going into a set of questions, taking a look at the strategies and actions associated with the focus area that you will be taking a look at. And then we'll come back. So before we come back into the main room, we'll do a summary of the conversation. What are the key highlights, key themes that your particular breakout room discussed, and then come back to the main room to share them. And so a few more details. Each breakout room will cover one focus area and the associated actions with that focus area. In the beginning of the workshop, we asked all of you that were there right at the beginning to take a poll and choose to focus either on ecosystems and the sequestration or community resilience and preparedness. And some of you indicated a preference for one or the other. So you'll get put into a room that discusses one or the other. If you didn't put a preference, or you entered the meeting just a little bit after that poll, then we'll pre-assign you. And if you get pre-assigned to ecosystems and sequestration and you'd really like to talk about community resilience and preparedness, just let your facilitator know. We'll put you back in the main room and get you reassigned. Today's discussion will really be focused on hearing your feedback to help refine the plan's actions related to these two focus areas. And before we head into the breakout rooms, I did want to share just a little bit. So we'll be asking about concerns and equity. We'll be doing a gap analysis with you. Is there anything that you think needs to be here that you're not seeing here. And then also gauging level of support. Maybe there's a particular strategy and associated action that really resonates, or you think it will have a really big impact, is really important for the city of Shoreline. We're going to capture that as well. And then those concerns, whether they're equity related concerns or other concerns, also capturing those as they relate to any particular action within the set of actions that you'll be taking a look at. So we've got a full team of facilitators to enable really small group discussions. And so Cameron and I will both be facilitating 2 of the breakout rooms. We also have Bethany Walbrecht-Dunn from City of Shoreline, as well as Alicia Hallberg from the City of Shoreline, Constance Perengi from the City of Shoreline as well. And then from my team, Alicia Fennell from Cascadia will be facilitating a breakout. So lots of facilitators across the breakout rooms to enable these smaller discussions, and really looking forward to getting into these breakouts to hear from you all. And so with that, letting us know, Haley, when we're ready to go. You'll see on your screen in just a moment that you're going to be whisked away into a breakout room. And we're going to be remaining in the breakout rooms for about 45 to 50 minutes before we come back and do a report out across the breakouts.
Awesome. I am opening rooms now.
Welcome back, everybody. We are back in the main room, and we are going to do a round robin where we hear from each of the breakout rooms and some of the key themes that came out of those conversations. And let's go ahead and start with breakout room 1.
Sure. All right. So yeah, my group was talking about the trees and ecosystems focus area, and some of the main themes. There was strong support for several of the actions. On the parks and street tree side, definitely looking for opportunities to convert lawn areas, and especially like underused ball fields, to forest and habitat, and especially a lot of fields in the Shoreline school system that are crumb rubber, noting that those are, hold more heat. So looking for opportunities to switch those out. Like the idea of providing trees for private property, definitely focus tree planting. And pointed out the need to look closer at sidewalks and get creative to how we can incorporate both more green stormwater infrastructure and trees into sidewalks and in areas to increase tree retention in areas where it's not currently required. And a bunch of other things.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. Any questions for Cameron and the discussion in group 1 before we move to group 2? Okay, so we'll head over to group 2. Some of the key themes or highlights that came out of that conversation.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. We were focused on community resilience and preparedness. And so generally there was strong support for the actions. A couple things to note, they did focus a lot on that maybe stronger requirements were needed rather than just incentives, but that some things should be requirements, and that the city should be leading in our efforts in all of these areas. There was also some additional information related to things related to emergency management response. So mentioned things that weren't in there, like what about snow? And then this idea that we do have a severe weather shelter that's overnight, but maybe adding a day site function to that as we continue to have these swings in cold weather. And then in terms of equity, to make sure the information provided education-wise is in language as much as possible, and continue to do outreach to those marginalized communities in order to both increase the education and then also just make sure that we are, again, doing that outreach and keeping that as a focus.
Thank you so much, Bethany. And breakout room 2. Any questions for Bethany on their discussion in breakout room 2 before we move to breakout room 3? Okay. Thank you so much, breakout room 2. And now we'll go over to breakout room 3.
And a really good discussion about the importance of aiming for actions that have the most persistent change and longest lasting benefits, and a lot of emphasis on changing codes and requirements for development, and making sure that everything that needs to happen happens in a timely way before we lose more time. it was interesting when we talked about some of the concerns in the second set of questions. This is about resilience, obviously. Something that was pointed out is that we need to refer to the heat map that was shown and use that as a basis to identify the homes and communities that are hotter, prioritize help to those, and have it be more neighborhood and locally based. Equity issues obviously came through about who would be able to make those changes and the importance of having emergency preparedness kits that would be available to everybody. We had a discussion about youth and education and how everybody wondered, what students are learning now, and making sure that this is part of the curriculum and a really solid way for them to understand how they can affect change. And one last thing that has come up in probably all of these is the importance of shared and environmentally friendly transportation, getting people out of their cars, and making sure that we have other ways to get around town, especially when light rail opens, that we have access to that.
Great.
Good conversation, and resilience can mean many things, it's obvious.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Constance. Any questions for Constance or breakout room 3 before we head over to hear a recap from breakout room 4? Great, thank you. Breakout room 4.
Great. We had a ton of great conversation in breakout room 4. We were focused on ecosystems and sequestration. I would say a lot of our conversation focused on sequestration and trees in the city. There was strong support for S1-11, which is increasing tree retention during development. A lot of discussion about keeping existing trees and not losing our old growth trees. There was a good discussion about ensuring the long-term health of new trees. So making sure when new ones are planted that they stick around for a long time, looking at what those retention percentages are when new trees are planted. So if they plant 100 trees, making sure not just 30% survive, but that all of them survive. A lot of discussion about getting the community more involved in decisions made and having more transparent communications and more opportunities for input for the public, and making information easier to find and not just relying on public records requests. And then last, a good discussion about financial support for education initiatives, and then the parks and street trees initiatives in 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6. I hope I summarized it okay. We discussed so much in our group.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much, Alicia. And breakout room 4. Any questions for Alicia? Okay. So I'll do a quick recap of breakout room 5, and then we'll turn it over to Alicia for breakout room 6. So a lot of support for the actions in the parks and street trees category. So we also talked about ecosystems and sequestration, and the importance of education, and as well as when we took a look at these, really wanting to take another look at the parks and street trees actions and make sure that the tall trees and existing trees are first line of defense against climate change. And so taking a look at codes related to that and any language kind of across the board related to preservation and importance of preservation. We also talked about kind of across the board with these actions, lack of focus on natural habitat, and that seems to be a lack of overall plan for a healthy ecosystem kind of across the board versus just focus on trees. And then it was also noted under equity that lower income individuals will likely be more impacted by the heat island effect, and needing to keep that in mind as we move forward with the strategies and actions. And just, across the board, importance of education and incentives to help maintain trees, existing trees. Any questions for my group related to those before we head over to our final breakout room? Alicia's group. Okay. Turning it over to, we've got two Alicias on the call. So turning it over to the other Alicia facilitator for breakout room 6.
Great, thank you, Gretchen. Well, yes, as with every group, we covered a lot. And so I'll just touch on some of the main things that we talked about. Our group discussed a need for education and outreach across many different ages. And also I was in one of the resilience and preparedness groups, forgot to say that. Our group talked about building resiliency into buildings and infrastructure, and especially to combat the urban heat island effect. There was discussion about the need for grid resilience, especially as we electrify. And then we also discussed the need to think about affordability and rent increases with anything that drives up the cost of construction and new buildings. And there are many other things as well, as everyone else said, but those were just some highlights. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing, Alicia. Any questions for Alicia's group before I turn it over to Cameron for next steps? Okay. So with that, thank you all so much for your very active and thoughtful and thought-provoking comments across the board in each of the breakout rooms. And I will turn it over to Cameron for where do we go from here?
Awesome. Thanks, Gretchen. And yeah, huge thank you to all of you. It was really great. Really enjoyed my time listening to you all. And yeah, it's just so fun to hear the report outs and a lot of great ideas here. So in terms of the next step, so this is the kind of the wrap up for our second phase of this process. So we will be compiling all of the feedback that we've heard thus far. And I will be posting the recording of this presentation portion as on the website, as well as the workshop summary. You can already find, as we mentioned, the recordings of the previous workshops are on the project page that we just sent in the chat. And I think 3 of the 4 project summaries so far are up there. So stay tuned for that. I will send you all an email and that'll include questions, answers to questions that we didn't get to. But yeah, in terms of the next step, so we'll also be doing a ranking and prioritizing process coming out of this based on your feedback, based off of a number of different criteria that we set early on in phase 1, and to create our short list of actions, which you will get to see again and provide more detailed comment on via a survey and via a final community climate conversation later this summer. So stay tuned for that. And if you want, you can sign up on that link. You can sign up for email updates from me telling you when those opportunities are live and when we post the different things. So if you're interested, please do visit that project page, or feel free to reach out to me directly. We can also, I'll put my email in the chat here before we sign off. But yeah, always happy to receive additional feedback, or if you have ideas that come to you, before you're falling asleep tonight, feel free to shoot me an email on that. So with that, I think I'll bring us to a close and just say thank you to everybody for sticking around with 2 hours. This is a ton of time on Zoom. So really, really appreciate your time and appreciate your input in this process.